in continuation of our discussions for the unit academic writing and research, we will now be discussing learning objective or session number 3, and that is entitled to be able to demonstrate the critical thinking skills. So for better understanding, let us define what does critical thinking is. So according to book, critical thinking skills is a systematic process because it follows a structured process in evaluating arguments and evidences. So these definitions gives us also the assumptions that critical thinking is the process of actively and skillfully analyzing, evaluating, and synthesizing information to form a seasoned judgment. So, a critical thinking also involves questioning assumptions, considering different perspectives, and making decisions based on logical reasoning and evidences rather than on personal biases and emotions. So, critical thinking is definitely a widely used in academics, business problem solving, and in decision making to ensure a sound judgment and a well supportive conclusions. So the steps to approach to critical thinking includes number 1, identify the arguments or problem. So we have to understand the issue or claim as a standards. So basically, before we analyze, it is essential to define the arguments, questions, or issue clearly. And these steps involve understanding what is being debated or solved. So what are the key considerations for step number 1? So number 1, we have to know what is the main issue or claim. Number 2, what is the purpose of the argument or problem. Number 3, who are the stakeholders affected. Like for example, a company faces a declining customer retentions. So the critical thinking identifies problem as why are customer leaving and how can we improve retentions. So number 2 steps is to gather and evaluate informations. So we have to assess the credibility and relevance of the sources. So we have to look for relevant data, evidence and sources, and assess the credibility and accuracy of that data. So in gathering and evaluating information, we have to consider the followings like, are the sources reliable? Are the sources an academic journal, expert opinion, or varied data? Are there conflicting pieces of evidences, or are the facts complete or important? An important thing is missing. So we have to look into that. Like for example, a company collects data from customers' feedback survey, sales report, and competitors' analysis to understand why customers are leaving. So these are basically a reliable sources coming from varied data. Um, and the informations provide factual thing. So number 3 is we have to analyze the argument structure. We have to break down the premises and make an initial conclusions, as these steps involve breaking down the argument into its key components. So premises are referring to supporting statement, and conclusions are referring to main claim or decisions. So in analyzing argument structure, we have to consider, are the premise logical leading to conclusions? Are there gaps in reasoning, or is the argument well structured or misleading? Like for example, if a business claim our customer service is the best, so customers should stay. Critical thinking should examine if there is an actual data supporting that claim. So, a critical thinker need not just to believe, but nonetheless need to ask for sources or for basis on that. So, number four is to identify assumptions and biases. So, on this step number four or stage number four, the critical thinker need to detect hidden biases and unsupportive assumptions, as many arguments are biased on hidden assumptions or biases that affects objectivity. Recognizing there is crucial to making rational decisions. So the key considerations in identifying assumptions and biases is that critical thinker need to check if there are underlying beliefs that taken for granted, or is there any emotional and ideological biases influencing the argument, or more so is the argument based on stereotypes or personal opinion. So like in the case of a manager, so a manager need to assume that customers only leave because of pricing. So a critical thinker would question these assumptions and consider factors like customer service, a product quality, and convenience. So number five steps is to evaluate the logic and coherence, as critical thinker need to check for more logical consistencies and fallacies. So this stage basically helps thinker checks whether the reasoning follows a logical principles and avoid fallacies or flaws in reasoning. So the key consideration on step number six is that critical thinker need to check if there are logical fallacies or hasty generalizations or false causes. A critical thinker also need to check the consistency of the argument, and do the premise provide strong enough support for the conclusions. Like for example, a business assumed that our competitors lowered prices and we lost customers. So price is the only factor. While a critical thinker will evaluate if this conclusion is logical, valid, or if other factors may be contributed. So number eight in the process is known to be called as consider alternative perspective, as critical thinker need to explore counter arguments. So this step requires critical thinker to consider the different viewpoints and counter arguments to form a balanced judgment. So the critical thinker need to check the following considerations, like are there alternatives, explanations, or solutions? Or what do opposing arguments suggest? Or how does the argument fits within a broader context? Like for example, instead of focusing only on pricing, the company explore alternative perspective, like do customer prefer competitors because a better product quality, or is their customer service affecting retentions more than prices? So this is how we consider alternative. We will not just be looking into one sides, but nonetheless we will be taking all sides. So number eight of the process is to draw evidence and base conclusions. We have to make judgment based on strong evidence, as conclusion should be based on facts, logic, and analysis rather than on assumptions and emotions. So in drawing evidence-based conclusions, we have to consider, does the evidence support the final decisions? Is the conclusion reasonable and well justified, or can the decisions be tested or replicated? Like for example, after analyzing the data, the business conclude that customer retentions dropped due to poor after-sales support. So not just pricing. So investigating is better in better customer service will prove retention. So before coming up into a judgment, we have to check, we have to verify, and we have to look on other facets, not just on one thing. So this is how a critical thinker usually decides or make decisions. So the last is the to reflect or to make a reflection and review. This is to reassess the process and findings. As the final steps involve self-reflections and re-evaluation to ensure that reasoning process was fair, logical, and even comprehensive. So the key considerations on step number 8 is to check whether if there are any overlooked biases or was their argument analyzed objectively or can the conclusion be improved with new evidences. So like for example, after completing customer service improvement, the company reviews retention rates again and check it further adjustment as needed. So basically, critical thinking is a structured process to analyze problems, making decisions, and forming judgment. And by following these 8 steps, individual can reduce biases, enhances reasoning, and take or make evidence-based decisions. So this method, 8 steps, is essential in academic research, business decision making, and even in our everyday problem solving life. So as per define, critical thinking skills enhances problem solving, making decisions, and analysis, helping individual evaluate informations more effectively and make a well-informed judgment. So the critical thinking skills involve critical reading, analysis and interpretation, being open-minded, self-regulations, and objective versus subjective thinking. So for better understanding, we will be discussing these skills one at a time. So as we have mentioned, critical thinking is the ability to objectively analyze, evaluate, and interpret information to form a reasoned judgment. It involves questioning assumptions, assessing evidences, and making an informed decisions. So one of the skills that we have mentioned is the critical reading. So critical reading involves actively engaging with text by questioning its content, evaluating the argument presented, and identifying biases or assumptions. So this reading involves actively engaging with text to understand its meaning, identify arguments, and even evaluates its credibility. So instead of passively absorbing information, a critical reader question analysis and interpret the content. So what are the skills involved in critical reading? So number one, we have the identifying the main points. This is about to distinguish between the central argument and the supporting details. So analyzing the logic of the argument is all about evaluating whether the reasoning in sounds and free from logical fallacies. And the third is to assess the credibility of the sources to determine whether the author, publisher, or evidence presented is reliable and unbiased. Like for example, A student reading a scientific article about a climate change critically examines the research methodology, the data sources, and the potential bias in the study rather than on simply accepting the information. So number two critical thinking skills is the analytical and interpretations. So this involves breaking down complex information into smaller parts, while interpretation is the process of understanding and explaining the meaning of that informations. So these skills involves breaking down complex ideas, understanding the relationship between concepts and interpreting their implications. So the skills involve to analyze or to analysis and interpretation is number one, examining relationship between ideas, understanding how different concepts connect or contradict each other. Understanding the implication is to consider the broader consequences of an argument or decisions. And last is drawing logical conclusions based on evidence, synthesizing information to form a well supportive conclusion. Like, for example, a business analysis studying customer behavior data examines the price, marketing strategies, and customer feedback influencing purchasing decisions to predict future trends. So number three or third in this critical thinking skills is the open-mindedness. It is the willingness of an individual to consider different perspectives and ideas even if they challenge one's own belief. So open-mindedness is critical thinking, which means considering multiple perspectives and being willing to change one viewpoint based on new evidences. So what are the skills involved in being an open-minded? So number one, listening to opposing views. This is about to actively hear and consider alternative perspective before forming a judgment. Number two is questioning one's own assumption. This is about to challenge personal belief to ensure they are based on facts rather than on biases. So number three is receptive to new informations. This is the willingness of an individual to adjust opinions when presented with strong, credible evidences. Like, for example, a policymaker reviewing arguments for and against a new tax reform listens to economic experts, business owners, and the general public before making a decisions, rather than relying on personal belief alone. So number four, critical thinking skill sets is self-regulation. So self-regulation is reflecting on one's own thoughts, process, ensuring that personal biases or emotions do not cloud judgment. So self-regulation is the ability of an individual to control one's thought process, recognize biases, and refine reasoning based on evidence. So the skills involved in self-regulation is adjusting thinking based on evidence. This is modifying the viewpoints when new credible data emerges. So number two is recognizing personal biases. So this is to identify how personal belief or experiments might influence reasoning. And last is being disciplined in avoiding snap judgment, taking the time to evaluate all aspects before drawing a conclusion. Like, for example, a medical researcher conducting, let's say, a drug trial avoids jumping to conclusion based on early test result. Instead, the medical researcher will wait for a comprehensive data before making a recommendations. So to top it all, critical thinking is a multifaceted skill set essential in academics, business, and everyday decision making. By developing these skills, the for one, critical thinking, critical reading, analysis and interpretations, open-mindedness, self-regulations, an individual become more effective problem solver, decision maker, and independent thinker. So critical thinking also involves objective and subjective thinking, depending on the context and purpose of the analysis. So understanding the difference between these two approaches is essential in academic research, decision making, and problem solving as well. So when we talk of objective thinking, it relies on facts and evidence. As or while subjective thinking is based on personal opinions, feelings, and experiences. So objective thinking is based on facts, evidence, and logical reasoning rather than on personal feelings or opinion, which is subjective. So it focuses on measurable and verifiable information. So that's a subjective thinking. So what are the skills required in objective thinking? Let me just check. So skills required in objective thinking. So analyzing data logically is important. So he or she need to interpret research findings, statistics, and empirical evidence. So recognizing biases and avoidance is second, as evaluating information critically without letting personal opinions interfere, and using evidence based reasoning, supporting conclusions with credible source and research. Like, for example, a research analyzing the effectiveness of a new teaching methods collect data from student test scores rather than relying on their personal opinions about methods success. So subjective thinking this time is based on personal experience, emotions, opinions, and perspective. So this subjective thinking is useful in creative, philosophical, and interpretive fields. So the skills that are needed for being a subjective thinker is we have to have emotional awareness. So we have to understand how feelings shape perceptions. So personal interpretations ah, of biases, forming opinion based on individual experience and insights, and expressing subjective perspectives clearly, presenting arguments persuasively while acknowledging they are personal views. Like, for example, a literature students analyzing the novel themes may interpret the character's emotions and motivations based on the personal understanding rather than on statistical data. So, what is the importance of critical thinking in academic research? So, critical thinking plays a crucial role in the academic research by ensuring clarity, depth, and innovations in argument. So, the following importance of critical thinking in academic research is number one, promoting creativity. So promoting creativity involves evaluating conventional ideas and exploring alternatives by questioning assumptions and considering new approaches. So researcher can generate innovative solutions and original insights. So critical thinking encourages students and researchers to explore new ideas, alternative solutions, and innovative perspective. So this promoting creativity impacts academic research by encouraging thinking beyond traditional perspective. It also led to breaking through and novel contributions in research. It even helps in developing original research questions, encourages thinking beyond conventional theories, and foster problem solving by exploring multiple approaches. Like, for example, a marketing student develops a new social media strategies based on analyzing emerging trends instead of following traditional marketing methods. So number two is improving language and presentation skills. So critical thinking helps researchers articulate ideas more clearly and structure their argument logically. So it even involves selecting precise language, organizing thoughts coherently, and presenting findings persuasively. So this helps a researcher structure argument logically and present ideas clearly and persuasively. So improving language and presentation skills impacts a well-structured, clear communication makes a research more accessible, credible, and convincing. So this basically enhanced the academic writing by ensuring coherence and clarity, develops concise and well-structured argument, and improves the ability to engage in academic discussions. Like, for example, a business student writing a research paper on customer satisfactions may organize findings in a logical sequence using a clear argument supported by evidences. So number three is thinking outside the box. So critical thinking challenges conventional wisdom, pushing researchers to explore conventional ideas and question standard methodology. So it promotes flexibility and adaptability in approaching complex problem. So thinking outside the box means researcher need to go beyond surface level analysis and explore unconventional solution. So researcher need just to focus on what is seen, but nonetheless, he should also focus on what he or she can offer better. So this impacts academic research because these skills led to innovative methodologies and fresh perspective in research. It even enhances the depth of originality of the study. So encouraging questioning, establish norms, develop the ability to approach problem from new agiles or angles, and strengthening research innovations are the usual thing on thinking outside the box. Like for example, instead of allowing a traditional research model, a researcher may examine how behavior psychology influences customer decisions. So number four is argument coherence. So argument coherence requires a logical connections between ideas, clear evidence, and structured reasoning. Critical thinking ensures that the research is logically consistent, avoiding contradictions and fallacies. So critical thinking ensures that arguments are logically connected, well structured, and free from contradictions. So this impact academic research by strengthening the quality of the research by ensuring that conclusions are well supported, clear, and logically sound. So the argument coherence strengthen the persuasiveness of the academic writing. It even ensures that the conclusions are logically driven from premises, and it helps in recognizing flaws in reasoning and avoiding fallacies. Like for example, a philosophy student writes logical essay on ethics, ensuring that every claim is supported by reasoning and consistent argument. So basically, an objective thinking relies on facts and logic, and subjective thinking is influenced by personal experiences and emotions. But whatever it is, both are valuable in different academic contexts. So, critical thinking in academic research enhances the creativity, the language skills, the innovations, and argument coherence, leading to a stronger research outcomes and intellectual development. So, evaluating an argument involves a systematic assessing the strength and soundness of reasoning presented. So, basically, we have two techniques include that is evidence testing and that is validity testing. So, these are used when evaluating an argument. These two are essentials in applying critical thinking techniques to assess the strength, the reliability, and the validity of the claims being made. So evidence testing and validity testings are two primary techniques used to assess the quality of the arguments. And these techniques helps ensure that the argument is logically sound and supported with credible and relevant evidence. So for better understanding, let us discuss this type one by one. So when we talk of evidence testing, it is a process of evaluating the quality, relevance, and reliability of the evidence supporting an argument. So it involves evaluating the quality and strength of the supporting evidence used in the argument. So this process helps determining whether the evidence provides adequately support the conclusions drawn. So the steps in evidence testing is to assess source credibility. We have to determine whether the evidence comes from a reliable and authoritative sources such as peer-reviewed journals or reputable institutions. So assessing source credibility means evaluating the reliability of the source providing the evidence. Is the source authoritative, well established, or peer reviewed? Like, for example, a study published in a peer reviewed scientific journal is generally more credible than random blog posts. We also have to check the relevance. We have to evaluate whether the evidence directly support the claim or argument being made. Irrelevant evidence weaken the argument. So checking the relevance ensures that the evidence directly addressed the claim or support the argument. So the irrelevant evidences weakens the argument foundation. Like for example, citing health statistics when arguing about educational policies may be not relevant, most especially if your research topic is about educations. So number three is we have to examine the accuracy and consistency. We have to cross-check facts and data across multiple sources to ensure accuracy. So consistent evidence from different credible sources strengthen the argument. We have to verify whether the evidence is accurate based on reliable data and consistent with other established facts or findings. Like, for example, cross-checking statistical data across multiple trusted sources to ensure consistency is in reporting findings. So the last one is the look for bias. We have to analyze whether the evidence is presented objectively or if it reflects a particular bias that might distort its reliability. So we have to consider whether the evidence is presented in a way that might be influenced by personal or institutional bias or bias in the evidence weaken the argument. Like, for example, a study funded by a tobacco company might have bias towards downplaying the health risk of smoking. So the outcome of evidence testing is a strong evidence enhances the credibility and persuasiveness of the argument, while weak or irrelevant evidence undermine it. So applying these steps can determine whether evidence supports the argument is credible, relevant, accurate, and unbiased. If the evidence fails any of these criteria, then automatically the argument becomes weaker and less convincing. So validity testing is defined as assessing whether the reasoning and logic of an argument are sound, coherent, and free from logical fallacies. This is the process of assessing whether the reasoning behind an argument is logically sound, and this step ensures that the argument is built on solid reasoning and free from logical errors. So what are the tests needed to apply or steps to apply validity testing? So number one is to analyze the argument structure. So we have to break down the argument into its premise and conclusion, ensuring that premise are logically leading to a conclusion. We have to break down the argument into components. So premise pertaining to supporting statements and conclusions determine if the premise is logically leading to conclusion. Like for example, in an argument claiming that all cats are animal, Felix is a cat, so Felix is an animal. So the argument structured logically with premise leading to a conclusions. Number two is to check for logical consistency. So we have to determine whether the reasoning follows a clear and logical patterns without contradictions or gap. We have to ensure that the argument is internally consistent and that the promise or premise do not contradict each other. So a contradiction weakens the argument validity. Like for example, if an argument states smoking is bad for health, but then claims it's okay to smoke in moderation, then it lacks a logical consistency. So number three is to identify logical fallacies as false cause, hasty generalizations, or ad hominem attacks that can weaken the argument validity. So we have to look for common fallacies that undermine the argument validity, such as ad hominem attacks, false dichotomies, or slippery slope argument. So these fallacies make the reasoning invalid. Like for example, the argument you should not trust his opinion on claims changes because he's not a scientist is an ad hominem fallacy attacking the person rather than the argument. So the last one is evaluate assumptions. So we have to identify any underlying assumptions and assess whether they are reasonable and supported by evidence. We have to identify any unspoken assumptions that the argument relies on. Assumptions that are false or unsubstantiated weaken the argument's validity. Like, for example, an argument claiming eating more vegetables is healthy because they are good for you assumes that all vegetables are healthy without further evidence or clarifications. So the outcome of this validity testing tells that a valid argument is logically sound and free from inconsistency, making it more persuasive and difficult to refute. So applying validity testing can be determined whether the reasoning behind an argument is logically sound and free from contradictions or fallacies. If the argument falls or fails any of these steps, then it is considered logically invalid and unpersuasive. So, applying evidence testing and validity testing helps in critically evaluating the strengths and reliability of the argument. So when evaluating an argument, both evidence testing and validity testings are crucial techniques to ensure the strengths and persuasiveness of the argument. So evidence testing helps verify the quality and credibility of the information, while validity testing ensures that the reasoning is logically tested and free from fallacies. So evidence testing need to show that the sources are credible and relevant, while validity testing need to demonstrate that the argument structure is logically sound, but the assumption about the importance of flexibility may need further evaluations. So this ends our discussions for learning objective number 3 of the unit academic writing and research.